Have you ever found yourself wondering whether what you're experiencing is stress, anxiety, burnout, or perhaps all three? People often use these words interchangeably, and that's completely understandable because they share a lot of symptoms and signs. You might feel exhausted, overwhelmed, irritable, unable to concentrate, or like you're constantly running on empty with any one of the three. But despite looking very similar on the surface, stress, anxiety, and burnout aren't actually the same thing at all. Understanding the differences can make a huge difference to how we respond to them. So let's talk about it today. Welcome or welcome back. Hi, I'm Rosie. I'm a disabled UK-based counsellor specialising in supporting disabled, neurodiverse, and chronically ill people with managing their mental health. Alongside private counselling, I make these videos to offer psychoeducation and support to the wider community, particularly for those who can't access counselling right now. These videos are not a replacement for counselling, but I hope that they can help you to better understand your own mental health and to manage it. So let's dive right in and start with stress. Stress is probably the one people are most familiar with, but it's also the one that's often most misunderstood. Stress isn't automatically a bad thing. In psychology, stress is essentially your mind and body's response to a demand or a challenge. That's all. That challenge might be approaching a deadline, for example, or an argument, financial worries, caring responsibilities or illness, or even positive things like getting married or moving house. Anything that requires you to adapt can create stress. When your brain perceives a challenge, your nervous system prepares you to deal with it. This is a logical process. Your body wants you to be able to adapt and overcome challenges in the environment, and that is why stress hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline increase. Your heart beats faster, your muscles tense, your attention narrows, and your body shifts into a state designed to help you respond. In small doses, stress can actually be incredibly useful. It can improve your concentration, motivate you to complete tasks, and help you respond quickly in emergencies. The problem comes when the demands don't stop. If your nervous system spends weeks or months believing that everything is urgent, it never really gets the opportunity to recover. In these situations, instead of returning to baseline, your body stays on high alert, and that can have a huge impact both on your physical health and your mental health. Another thing that helps us to identify stress is that it often has a fairly identifiable source. You might think, I'm stressed because work is very busy, or I'm stressed because I'm caring for a sick family member, or I'm stressed because I'm dealing with ongoing health problems myself. The important thing here is that stress tends to be connected to something tangible or happening around or within you. It's cause and effect. This event is happening and my response to it is heightened. Now let's compare that with anxiety. Anxiety is also a completely normal human emotion. Every single one of us experiences anxiety sometimes. Yes, even the most chilled out person you know experiences anxiety too. Like stress, anxiety exists because it has an evolutionary purpose. It helps us to notice danger and prepare for potential threats. But anxiety differs from stress in one important way. Stress is generally responding to something happening now or in the near future. Anxiety is often responding to something that might happen. Subtle difference, but it's an important one. Because your brain begins to try and predict outcomes. It starts asking questions like, what if I fail? What if something goes wrong? Or what if they don't like me? Or what if my symptoms get worse? I hear that a lot. And maybe even, what if I can't cope? Sometimes those concerns are realistic and proportional. Sometimes they're much less likely than they feel. Anxiety is essentially our brain trying to predict and prevent future problems. It's a safety mechanism, and you can easily see the through road for why it exists. If I predict this outcome, I can emotionally prepare for it. On the surface, that is logical and seems helpful. Unfortunately, the anxious brain often overestimates danger whilst underestimating our ability to cope. That's why reassurance only helps for a little while. So you might try to reassure yourself, no, it'll probably be fine. And then 5 minutes later, your brain produces another what if. Because anxiety isn't really asking for information, it's asking for certainty. And the truth about life, however uncomfortable it may be, is that certainty is something life rarely grants us. One thing I often explain to clients is that anxiety can become self-perpetuating. Perhaps you notice your heart racing and you think, why is my heart racing? This might feel like a search for information that you're doing at the time, but usually what's happening is there's a desire for certainty about that sensation, right? But that certainty can't be granted to you because, well, a racing heart can happen for so many reasons. So then your anxiety increases because you've noticed the sensation and because there isn't one single reason to attribute it to. Now, your heart races even faster, which makes you more anxious, and before long you've created this kind of cycle where the body's anxiety response becomes something your brain interprets as further evidence that something must be seriously wrong. This is one of the reasons panic attacks can feel so frightening. The physical symptoms themselves become part of the thing we're afraid of because they feel like indicators that a panic attack is going to happen or it's happening again, or the fear that you might die. Now let's move on to burnout, because burnout's a little bit different from both stress and anxiety. Burnout isn't simply being stressed for a really long time, although that's a common component. Traditionally, burnout referred specifically to chronic workplace stress that hadn't been successfully managed. More recently, people also use it to describe prolonged exhaustion caused by caring responsibilities, parenting, studying, disability, chronic illness, or just carrying too many life responsibilities for too long with poor management techniques. The key idea is chronic depletion. Burnout usually develops gradually rather than suddenly. It's a slow decline over a period of time, not an overnight sensation. At first, you might simply feel under pressure. Then you start needing longer to recover. Then everyday tasks start feeling much harder. One or two early warning signs of burnout are that rest stops feeling restorative, and activities that once gave you energy start feeling more like obligations. When even your favorite things feel like they're taking more than they're giving back, it's worth paying attention and turning towards the experience with some curiosity. Eventually, with burnout, you reach a point where even things you normally enjoy feel like too much effort. People often describe this to me as feeling emotionally numb, not necessarily anxious, not necessarily sad, just kind of empty, like there's nothing left to give or the tank on the car is empty. And one of the defining features of burnout is that rest just doesn't immediately resolve it. Most of us know the feeling of having a stressful week and then feeling much better after a relaxing weekend of playing ping pong or having a pint at the local pub or feeding the ducks or, whatever you might consider a relaxing weekend to be. But burnout is different. You might take several days off and still feel really exhausted, or longer. You might be off for weeks or even months and that exhaustion is still there because what you're recovering from isn't one difficult week. It's months, sometimes even years, of your nervous system trying to meet demands that exceed your available resources. I've used this analogy before when discussing energy management, that of being energy being like a bank account. So you can go and watch that video after this one if you're struggling with your energy management. But essentially you can think of it as being in debt when you're in burnout. One thing I think that is really important to acknowledge here is that burnout isn't simply about working too hard. It's about the relationship between demands and recovery. Let's take it into an example of going into work. Two people might work exactly the same number of hours, and one might experience burnout whilst the other one doesn't, even in the same job role. So why does that happen? Because burnout depends on far more than workload alone. It rests upon several interconnected factors of energy. It depends on things like autonomy, support, financial pressure, discrimination, disability, chronic illness, caring responsibilities, trauma history, perfectionism, sleep problems, whether your effort feels meaningful or appreciated. This is particularly relevant for disabled people and people living with chronic illness. Managing symptoms is work. Attending doctor's appointments is work. Planning around fluctuating energy takes work. Advocating for your own needs is work. Masking pain or neurodivergence is work. Something I've noticed when I sit down with clients to identify why they're burnt out or struggling is they have a high focus on outcome-driven activities like work and don't factor in things like staying on top of their laundry or having difficult conversations about disability access. Going back to the banking metaphor, this is like writing a budget and forgetting to factor in less obvious expenses, like going out for a coffee or seeing a film at the cinema. You still spent the money, but because it wasn't a regular purchase and because you didn't put it in the budget, the money has disappeared without being accounted for. People often underestimate just how much invisible effort goes into simply getting through the day. That invisible effort still consumes energy, whether you notice it or not. So how can you tell which one of these three things you're experiencing right now? A rule of thumb when you try to figure out which of these three things you're going through is this. Stress says I have too much to do. Anxiety says, what if I can't cope? Burnout says, I've got nothing left. Of course, real life is rarely that neat and categorical. Many people experience all three together. Perhaps chronic stress contributes to anxiety. Then that anxiety makes resting more difficult because you're remaining on high alert from the stress all the time. Then eventually that lack of recovery leads to burnout. And honestly, that's actually a fairly common pathway in presentation, so try not to panic if you notice all three. This is a good opportunity to reflect on what you can do to help and support yourself, and where you can ask for support from others too. So you might be wondering, if the symptoms overlap so much, why does distinguishing them really matter in the first place? Because, well, what helps one isn't always going to help the others. If you're experiencing all three, you can throw the kitchen sink at it, but different things might be needed if you're experiencing one but not the others. When we're stressed, reducing demands where possible and increasing recovery can be incredibly effective. When we're anxious, we often need to work with our thoughts, our behaviors, our nervous system responses, rather than endlessly chasing reassurance and comfort. When we're burnt out, the answer isn't usually becoming more productive. It's creating enough space for genuine recovery whilst you're examining the conditions that led to the burnout in the first place and making alterations where possible. One error of thought I see fairly often is people treating burnout as though it's a motivation problem. They say, I just need to push through, or if I keep going, I'll feel better. I just need to be disciplined, or maybe I need to get back to how I used to be. God, I hear that one so often. Unfortunately, that's often the very mindset that contributed to the burnout in the first place. If someone had a broken leg, we wouldn't tell them to run until it heals. Many of us speak to ourselves this way, though, when our mental health is struggling. Another mistake is assuming anxiety disappears once we've solved every possible problem. The anxious mind is incredibly creative. Solve one worry and it will produce another. That's why therapy is frequently less focused on eliminating uncertainty and more on increasing our ability to tolerate it. And stress? Stress isn't always something we can eliminate either. Sometimes the stressful situation genuinely exists and persists. You might still have caring responsibilities or a health problem of your own. You may still have financial pressures. In those situations, therapy often becomes about increasing your resilience, improving your own internal and external boundaries, improving strategies for resting, problem solving where it's possible, and reducing unnecessary sources of stress, rather than pretending that everything can simply disappear. So what practical things can help? Firstly, ask yourself what you're responding to. Is there an actual demand happening right now? Am I worrying mostly about the future? Or do I simply feel depleted regardless of what's happening today? Secondly, notice your recovery. When was the last time your nervous system genuinely kind of switched off? Not scrolling on your phone while thinking about work. Not collapsing into bed completely exhausted. I mean actual recovery. Time where your brain wasn't constantly anticipating the next demand you have to fulfill, or that you feel you have to fulfill. Thirdly, become curious about your expectations of yourself. Many people experiencing burnout hold themselves to standards that they would never expect from somebody else. They believe rest has to be earned, that asking for help means failure, that slowing down is equivalent to laziness. Those beliefs often keep burnout going long after the original stressors appeared. And finally, remember that your body is giving you information, not betraying you. Exhaustion, anxiety, stress, these are all important signals that something needs attention. It's worth becoming curious rather than immediately judging yourself for having these experiences. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know I often encourage curiosity over criticism. I bang on about it, to be honest with you. Instead of asking what's wrong with me, it can help to be more curious. What is my body trying to tell me? It doesn't produce an immediate answer all the time, which I know can be frustrating, but it's usually a much kinder place to begin. Finally, I want to say something to those of you who are living with chronic illness, disability, or neurodivergence specifically. It can be incredibly difficult to recognize burnout when your baseline already includes fatigue or limited energy. Likewise, anxiety can become tangled up with genuine uncertainty about your health, and stress may come from systems that genuinely aren't accessible to you. That doesn't mean your experiences are any less real. It also doesn't mean every difficult feeling is just anxiety. Sometimes our circumstances are really difficult, and the goal isn't to convince yourself that everything is fine when it isn't. It's to understand which parts you can influence, which parts deserve compassion, and where support might actually help you. Understanding the difference between stress, anxiety, and burnout won't resolve anything overnight. But having the language to describe your experience is often the first step towards responding to it more effectively. Because if we misunderstand the problem, we often end up using solutions that were never actually designed for it. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If this episode has resonated with you, I'd really appreciate it if you can, like the video, subscribe, share it with other people, all of the YouTube stuff. As always, I'd love to know in the comment section whether you've experienced any of these three things, stress, anxiety, or burnout, or perhaps all three, and what you've found the most helpful. If you're interested in working with me on a one-to-one, you can find information about my counselling practice in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and take really good care.